The babysitter's last text. Who's upstairs? The text came at 9:58 on a wet Friday in early November, the screen lighting the dim kitchen of a craftsman house on Maple Ridge Avenue in the town of Larkspur, Pennsylvania. The babysitter had written only 3 words, spaced as if she had to force her thumbs to move. Who's upstairs? Before we begin, tell me, where are you listening from? And what time is it there? Her name was Ione Kestrel, a college sophomore who took evening jobs to pay for studio art supplies and a public transit pass to the city. She was a quiet soul with a quick wit, the kind of person who noticed the way rain made halos around streetlights and the way children's laughter changed when they grew tired. 2 kids slept under that roof that night, a 6-year-old boy named Briar and his 3-year-old sister named Lark. Their parents, Rowan and Maeve Harrow, had left at 7:15 for an anniversary dinner at a restaurant by the river. The year, if you need to understand the way phones hummed and doorbell cameras watched, was 2019. The house at 42 Maple Ridge was one of those old American stories, built in wood and memory, a deep porch with a swing that complained just enough to be charming, oak floors that spoke out loud when the humidity changed, crown molding thick as a picture frame. At the back, a narrow staircase rose from the mudroom to a short landing, and then up again into the second floor where the bedrooms sat in a row like well-behaved children. At the top of the main stairs, there was a crawlspace door that had once led to a linen closet and now led to a barely insulated wedge of attic, hot in summer and sharp with cold in winter, the kind of door that makes a welcome thud when it closes and an unwelcome thud when it doesn't. Before the Harrows left, they did all the small, loving rituals. Maeve set out a plate of sliced apples, a bowl of popcorn, and a note that read, "Help yourself to anything except the scotch." Rowan pointed to the thermostat and said the heat pumps kick on if the temperature dips. Fancy house, but the bones are stubborn. He smiled at Ione in the doorway, hair damp from the drizzle, denim jacket dotted with rain. Text us if the storm knocks the power out. Text us if the kids wake and ask for the song about the lighthouse. Text us even if you think it'll make us look overprotective. It won't. At 7:30, the children were bathed, pajamaed, and nestled into beds that smelled faintly of line-dried sheets. Ione read the lighthouse song twice, and the little girl fell asleep with a hand on the brother's shoulder, a tether strong enough to hold a moon in place. At 8, the dishwasher hummed its modest lullaby. At 8:20, the rain came harder, dropping like a handful of pebbles thrown by a polite intruder. At 8:42, the doorbell camera pinged, announcing a raccoon with ambitions. Ione's phone ticked with messages from a group chat, small bursts of jokes and memes. She answered 2 and then set the phone face down, because she had promised herself she would be the kind of sitter who watched and listened. She put a kettle on. She chose a mug with a hairline crack because hairline cracks reminded her of river maps. She stood at the back window and watched the alley, where a single streetlight blew a cone of yellow onto the wet blacktop like a candle someone had forgotten to snuff. At 9:21, a floorboard spoke upstairs. It was not the sound of a child rolling over and not the polite pop of wood releasing humidity. It was a stepped-on sound, slow and weight-bearing, forward and then a tiny, deliberate back. Ione took one breath, then another. The kettle clicked off. The house returned to its normal choir. She checked the baby monitor screen. 2 small forms slept. The greenish night vision painting dreams onto their faces. She told herself she knew old houses. She told herself wind can make timber say things it doesn't mean. At 9:36, the sound came again, above the kitchen this time, in the hallway between the children's rooms. One step and another. A long pause. Then the faintest scrape, as if someone had scuffed a shoe and then, embarrassed by the sound, tried to rub it out with the sole. The kind of scrape that turns the air thin. Ione lifted the house phone from its cradle because old houses carry old phones like relics. No dial tone because this was 2019 and the landline was a costume. She put it back and picked up her cell. No missed call, no alert from the doorbell camera. She opened the parent's contact, hovered, did not press. First, she would look, she would be careful. She would not give Rowan and Maeve a reason to race home on wet roads unless there was a reason. She climbed the back stairs because they felt less like a stage. Each step was shallow and careful. The rain softened to a hiss. Her breath became a guest she had to host with manners. At the landing, the air grew cooler. She could see down the short hall into the little boy's room, the lighthouse nightlight casting a steerable arc of white. She could see the girl's room door nearly closed, just enough to make a crescent, the way some children like it. She could also see the crawlspace door at the top of the main stairs. It was closed, latch turned. That mattered more than it should have. She waited. Sometimes the house wants to know if you have patience. Sometimes it will reward you with silence. Sometimes it will not. There was a third sound, not a footfall this time, but a breath. Not hers. Not a child's soft, open-mouth exhale, but the kind of breath that pauses at the end like it is tasting the air. It came from the darkness beyond the crawlspace door, except the door was shut. Ione felt the tiny hairs along her forearms confess themselves to fear. She stepped into the boy's room. He slept with his mouth open just a little, lower lip shiny. Good. She stepped to the girl's room. Little Lark had turned onto her stomach, stuffed rabbit tucked under her chin. Good. When Ione moved back into the hall, her eyes caught something at the far end where the light thinned. A strand of damp hair lay across the floorboards, faint as a pencil mark, a single narrow ribbon that did not belong to either child. It glistened. She knelt without thinking and picked it up. Cold. Clean. Long enough to belong to someone grown. She stood up too quickly and steadied herself with a hand on the wall. Her palm pressed into a nail head that had been painted over and sanded down so smooth it felt like a coin. She thought the oddest thought then. If I press that nail in, will the crawlspace door open by itself? She smiled at herself because fear makes even introverts dramatic in their own skulls. She returned to the back stairs, slow and exact, and only when she reached the fourth step from the bottom did she glance at her phone. The time read 9:58. The text she sent herself, as if letting the words exist outside her head could make them smaller, was only 3 words. Who's upstairs? She meant to send it to Rowan. She meant to send it to Maeve. She meant the message as a half-joke with a serious underlayer. But the thumb that had learned to move fast learned the wrong dance. It went to her friend in the group chat, and by the time she realized, the message had already become a tiny flare in half a dozen pockets around town. Her friend replied with, "What are you doing?" and also joking, right? And also put them on speaker. Ione did not reply. She set the phone on the counter face up this time. She took the largest knife from the drawer and then immediately put it back because knives are not courage and courage is not noise. She chose instead a heavy flashlight from the mudroom shelf, the kind that doubles as a hammer. She clicked it on. The beam carved a clean white tunnel along the baseboards. She moved to the bottom of the main staircase now, because if fear wants you to circle, wisdom wants you to cross. The newel post was worn as a handshake. Family photographs climbed the wall. A wedding photograph near the bottom showed Rowan in a blue suit and Maeve in a dress with sleeves that looked like light. Higher up, a picture of Briar in a lion costume, nap-flattened mane, grinning with the sincerity only a 6-year-old can manage. Above that, near the top, a framed landscape. The glass reflected the flashlight beam like a lid. Halfway up, she paused. There was that breath again. Not a cough, not a snore. A breath like someone who had been holding still too long and had to remind their body to keep doing the automatic things. The sound came from beyond the last step, in the shadow to the left, where the crawlspace door Saturday. It was closed, latch turned. She aimed the beam at the brass. The metal showed a fog that had not been there a minute ago, condensation, from a mouth that had exhaled near it. She kept her own mouth shut because you cannot take breath back once it is out. The latch moved. It moved too gently to be gravity. It made the tiniest metal-on-metal sigh. Then it stilled, as if the person behind the door had realized they had announced themselves and decided to pretend nothing had happened at all. Ione's voice, when it came, was not loud. It was firm in the way a music teacher's voice is firm when she asks a child to stop tapping the desk with a pencil. I'm a babysitter. The police are on their way. If you are a neighbor who has made a mistake, this is your chance to leave without me seeing your face. If you are not a neighbor, this is your chance to decide to be one. Nothing moved. But the house did a small thing then. It clicked. A sound traveled through the baseboards from kitchen to parlor like a cricket chirp. The refrigerator compressor had kicked on. The world had not narrowed to only this door. She stepped higher. She brought the beam closer to the latch. She did not touch it. She watched a drop of moisture on the brass slide very slowly toward the handle and then stop, held by a force that did not want to be named. From the children's rooms, nothing. From outside, rain. From down the hall, a draft like someone had opened a mouth to speak and then decided not to. She took the phone, thumb shaking now not from drama, but from the body's strange understanding of scales. She typed 911 and the call went through on the first chime. The dispatcher answered with a first name and a county. Ione told that calm voice her name, the address, the fact of 2 sleeping children, the fact of a locked door with breath behind it that did not belong to the family. The voice said, "Officers are on the way." The voice said, "Stay on the line." The voice said, "Do not open the door." So she did not. She watched it the way you watch a stage when you know the performer is already in the wings. She told the dispatcher every small thing she saw. The latch is fogged. The brass is pitted near the screw head. The paint around the jamb is chipped the way it chips when someone tries to open a door with a butter knife. The dispatcher asked about the kids, and she told her about the lighthouse song because sometimes the answer to a safety question is a story that proves you are paying attention. It took 6 minutes for the first cruiser to roll into the alley, though those 6 minutes ran long like string you cannot find the end of. 2 officers climbed the porch steps, rang the bell softly out of habit, then tried the knob and announced themselves. Ione walked down the main stairs, not taking her eyes from the crawlspace door, unlatched the front door, and stepped back quickly so the officers could enter. Their names were Officer Tamsin Dupre and Officer Hal Moran. They were young enough to still wear the job like a coat borrowed from a bigger relative, and old enough to know when to keep their weapons holstered because children were sleeping. Ione pointed. The hall was framed now by their bodies and the yellow hallway light and the cleaner light of the flashlight. Officer Dupre nodded, raised a hand to let silence accumulate, and then approached the door with a slowness that reminded Ione of a conductor raising a baton before the first downbeat. Dupre put 2 fingers lightly on the latch and did not move it. She bent, eye to the thin seam between door and jamb. She inhaled. She did not exhale for a count of 3. Then she did, a controlled tide. She mouthed one word to Moran. There. Moran moved with that cop-slow speed that reads as kindness until it becomes a tackle. He positioned himself on the knob side. Dupre took the hinge side. They counted without sound. Moran turned the knob and pulled. The door did not open. Dupre drove her shoulder low into the panel, and the old wood decided to be new and gave with a crack that sounded like an ankle breaking far away. The space beyond was small, angled, cluttered, with things families save because they carry stories in them. A fan with no blade, a suitcase with travel stickers that meant Paris had existed once for someone in this house. 3 plastic bins of children's clothes marked in black marker, a broken chair that had not given up, and a person, folded into the angle between floor and pitch, knees under chin, face turned away from the light, hands empty and ready to lie about it. Dupre said, "Do not move." Moran said, "Show me your hands." The person did not show their hands. They lifted their left shoulder like someone about to stand in a narrow coffin, and then realized there was no way to both stand and not be seen. They kept their face turned. A smell came from the small hot space that was not attic smell. It was sweat and wool and rain and a cologne Ione could not name but would recognize for years in crowds and feel a short-lived lightening in her spine. The person finally shifted enough for the light to catch their cheekbone. Smooth, young, the jawline of someone who still believes they can sneak back to the version of themselves that did not make this choice. Dupre reached. The person flinched, then stilled. Moran took the wrists, quick. Plastic cuffs clicked, and Saturday. The person whispered one word so fast and so quiet, it sounded like a sound and not a word. Please. There are nights when a house rearranges what you know about it. There are nights when law and luck arrive at the same time and dress alike so you cannot tell who deserves the thank you. There are nights when children sleep through the loudest noises and wake to the softest ones. Breyer woke when Officer Dupre gently asked Ione if the boy had a favorite song she could sing while they stepped this stranger past his doorway and into a world that would be, for the stranger, smaller and heavier. Ione sang the lighthouse song, the boy rolled over, the girl sniffed twice, and then reclaimed her rabbit. The name given at the kitchen table later, with the cuffs off and the hands folded around a paper cup of tap water, was Corin Vale. He was 22, a barback at a music venue downtown, a part-time mover for a storage company on the edge of town, a person whose landlord had changed the lock that very afternoon because rent was late again, and who had wandered past the Harrow's house just after 9, watching rain stencil shadows on the porch. He said the front porch light was off, that the back alley light was the kind that made him nervous because it buzzed. He said he had once done a job in this very house, moving boxes after Maeve's mother passed, that he knew the crawlspace door did not always latch if you pushed too hard. He said all this in a way that sounded like memorized lines. Officer Moran left for a minute and returned with a small bag-tagged chain of custody. Inside, a multi-tool with a narrow flathead blade that would fit under a painted jam and lever it without much damage, a pair of cheap cotton gloves, damp, a folded postcard someone had intended to mail, featuring a lighthouse on the coast of Maine, and a note written in pencil that read, "We are well, love you, see you in December." The postcard had not been addressed yet. Corin looked at the lighthouse as if it had insulted him. "Why?" Officer Dupre asked. "Are you in a crawl space with a multi-tool?" Corin said he wanted to get out of the rain. He said he saw the back door wasn't fully latched. He said he knocked and no one answered. He said he stepped inside to be out of the weather. He said he heard children and then realized he had made a mistake and was trying to hide until he could unmake it. He said he had not gone near the bedrooms. He said he had not taken anything. He said most lies are just a breath away from the truth if you hold the breath long enough. The doorbell camera proved he had never rung. The back door, which Ione had locked after the raccoon, had not been forced, which meant the multi-tool had met the strike plate and learned a new way to talk. The thin condensation on the latch proved his face had been inches from the brass, as if he were listening through metal to weigh his chances. The damp hair on the hallway floor did not match Ione or the children. It matched Corin. The officers did not say poetry out loud, but sometimes evidence makes a poem whether or not you want it. Rowan and Maeve arrived at 10:28, windblown and wet, faces open with fear, and then with the specific relief parents make when they count the number of children and find the number unchanged. Maeve thanked Ione, then thanked Officer Dupre, then thanked the kettle for existing because it gave her hands something to do. Rowan walked to the base of the main stairs and looked up at the crawlspace door and put his hand on the newel post like a man greeting an old friend and apologized under his breath to the house for not knowing it needed him tonight. The rain slowed, the streetlight outside defined every leaf as if auditioning them for a brighter job. Corin Vale sat at the kitchen table and looked smaller and then larger and then smaller again, the way a person does when they realize they have chosen a story they cannot revise. He asked for a lawyer then, as was his right, and the night shifted into a new shape with paperwork and phone calls and the sound of zippers on evidence bags. Later, after the officers had gone and the house had been put back in order with all the rituals humans use to convince themselves the world is knowable, Rowan stood on the porch and stared at the street. A car hissed by, tires whispering on wet asphalt. Somewhere a train declared itself. He turned when Ione stepped onto the porch with 2 mugs of chamomile tea and the brittle, beautiful calm people make after the danger has taken its hands off their shoulders. He said thank you a dozen ways that did not use the word thank. She said, of course a dozen ways. That meant I am shaking on the inside, but I am still here. Maeve joined them, the porch light warming the edges of her hair, and the 3 of them stood in a small triangle like a warning sign no one else would read. When Maeve spoke, her voice had a new floor under it. We will change the locks. We will reinforce that door. We will move the postcard basket. We will install a sensor that turns on a light at the slightest motion. We will do the things that let us sleep. Ione nodded and did not say that sleep would come with its own sounds now. The sound of a breath behind a door. The sound of a latch fogging. The sound of a floorboard speaking the truth. There is a detail the police report will not mention, because police reports must make simple lines out of crooked nights. At 9:59, after sending the text to the wrong chat and before calling emergency services, Ione leaned her forehead against the cool plaster of the stairwell for the space of one heartbeat. She whispered something that was not quite a prayer and not quite a promise. Okay, if someone is up there, I will not be the person who opens the door and invites them in. I will be the person who names the danger out loud. Sometimes that is the whole difference. Not bravery that charges, but the steadiness that refuses to be tricked into being polite to danger. The next morning, the November sky tried on a bland blue and liked it. The town of Larkspur went back to the work of a Saturday. Kids in hoodies kicked at leaf piles. The bakery line wrapped twice around the counter. A woman in a gray coat standing by the river thought the water sounded like someone ripping silk very slowly and wondered who she would tell that to. Ione slept past noon and woke to a peanut butter text from Maeve, which read in that shaky grammar of gratitude, "Come by for dinner anytime. And also, I found your denim jacket on the porch swing. And also, there will be pie tonight if you want pie." She smiled and answered with too many thank yous and one yes to pie. She showered longer than she needed to, stood still in the water in a way that made time into a warm curtain, then dressed in gently clean clothes that smelled like detergent and a future. When she stepped outside, the air had that crisp, crisp edge. That means the first hard frost has already visited and left behind a postcard of itself on every windshield. Maple Ridge Avenue looked like an old movie taught to speak color. She walked past houses that had their curtains open a little wider than usual, past neighbors who held eye contact just a second longer, the way people do when the story has almost become a myth and they want to remind themselves it is still shaped like a person. On the Harrow's porch, there were new screws in the latch. The crawlspace door upstairs had a length of wood screwed diagonally across it like a stern eyebrow. A small motion sensor had been installed in the hall. It blinked a polite green and then went to sleep. The kids were in socks, sliding across the floor, laughing the laugh that children make the morning after a storm when the yard is new again. Rowan handed Ione a slice of apple pie on a paper plate and said again what he had said the night before, but with the daylight, making his voice warmer. You kept your head, you called, you stayed steady. That is the whole job sometimes. We will tell people that part when we tell them the story. Not who he was, not what he said, not the smell. We will tell them you named the danger and didn't let it decide your speed. The town told the story in its own ways. The newspaper, which had been saved from extinction by a stubborn editor named Lita Quinn, wrote a piece with the careful headline, "Babysitter's Quick Thinking Leads to Arrest in Overnight Burglary Attempt." The group chat learned, gently from Ione herself, that sometimes jokes congeal into myths, and myths can be mean. At the music venue, a bartender wiped the length of the bar 3 times, then once more, then stopped. At the storage company, a supervisor stared at a stack of moving blankets and tried to add up what the numbers meant about people. There is not a moral here, sharp and so clean it can cut bread. There is not an ending where everyone claps and the house resumes being only a house. There remains a door with a new diagonal board and screws that will loosen over time and be tightened again. There remains a boy who will ask, on a night 2 weeks later when rain drums the gutter, "Can you sing the lighthouse song one more time?" And a girl who will say, not the part where the foghorn sounds, that part sounds like a giant in the crawlspace. There remains a young man named Corin, whose first court date will arrive with a sky the exact color of the alley light, and who will have to decide whether to say the word sorry to the ceiling or to the faces in the room. At 9:58 on some future night, a phone will light in some other kitchen in some other town, and a person will type 3 words spaced out as if their thumbs had to be convinced. Who's upstairs? If you are that person, hear this story as a map of breath. Name the danger, make the call, keep your voice exactly as loud as it needs to be and no louder. Stand where you can see doors and hallways. Carry light. Remember that a latch that fogs is a sentence the house is trying to say. Let the sentence finish. If you are listening from a city, may the traffic outside be ordinary and honest. If you are listening from a farmhouse that knows every creek by its first name, May the wind be the only guest tonight. If you are listening in a small apartment where the neighbor's footsteps already live in your ceiling, may you learn the grammar of each tread so well that the first strange syllable tells you exactly what to do. The babysitter's last text was a question pointed upstairs, but the real end of the story is how she answered all the other questions pointed at her. Will you panic? Will you try to be polite when the moment calls for clear? Will you open a door because silence asked sweetly? She chose no, no, and no. She chose the shape of a steady voice on a thin line. She chose to be the reason the house could go back to being only wood and memory. Some nights, when she passes the Harrows by chance and the porch swing is still, she hears only the rain and the river, and that is enough. Some nights, she hears the old door upstairs settle as the heat kicks on and thinks, with a small smile, that even a house can be taught to breathe more quietly. And on the better nights, every window along Maple Ridge holds a square of light cut, perfect as a fresh slice of pie, and the street keeps its watch, and the children sleep so deep the world could rewrite its rules, and they would wake to the new rules fresh and ready to be memorized. If that happens where you are, tell me when. Tell me what the air smells like. Tell me the hour, spoken slowly so the world cannot run away with it. Tell me if the latch on your upstairs door is dry and dull or a little fogged from someone's breath. Tell me if you are holding a mug with a hairline crack that looks like a river map. Tell me if the house has taught you any of its words. And if your phone lights at 9:58 and the message reads as simple and terrible as a knock, remember the kitchen in Larkspur and the steady girl in the denim jacket, and say out loud to no one and to everyone, not tonight, not on my watch, not in this house. He found a staircase in the lake it still goes up. He saw it when the wind fell off and the lake lay down like glass, a sudden stillness that made every shoreline detail stand at attention. The afternoon sun had taken a step toward evening, yellowed and steady, and the north cove of Lake Lanier went calm enough to show the bones under it. He cut his aluminum skiff to idle and drifted toward the pale shoulder of exposed clay. There, not random at all, a run of stone steps pushed up from green water and kept going into nothing the shore could explain, even and true, as if they still believed a front door was waiting at the top. Before we begin, tell me, where are you listening from and what time is it there? This was late September 2022, after a summer of stingy rain and long afternoons when the heat felt like it had signed a lease. The lake sat northeast of Atlanta, a blue map of drowned hills and red clay coves, and that year it had read its gauge and decided to show some of what history had asked it to forget. Foundations revealed themselves like old teeth. The ghostly lanes of a two-lane road slipped out of the murk and pointed nowhere. Between Bald Ridge and the mouth of 6 Mile Creek, a staircase announced itself and waited for a person with the right kind of attention to see it. Riven Kettering had that kind of attention. 38. A carpenter and part-time rescue diver who liked small engines and the honest work of making broken things carry weight again. He lived in a rental off Pilgrim Mill Road with a dog who had taught herself to sleep through sirens. He was not a romantic, not really. He was the kind of man who listened to what a hinge said when it wasn't being looked at. The lake had been a job and a solace for him since he moved down from the foothills of Tennessee a decade earlier, and on afternoons like this one, he took his old skiff out to idle over the drown. The staircase began 3 steps below the surface, pale rectangles set into the clay, then climbed above waterline, slick with algae, where yesterday had touched and left. 12 risers showed drop. They marched up the bank as if they had no intention of stopping, then continued past where stone ended, the air holding their measure with a confidence that made nothing in Riven's head feel quite steady. He nosed the skiff forward until its snub bow made a soft knock against the lowest dry riser. The hull and the stone talked for a second, low and hollow. He stood, keeping knees loose, eyes at a level where you can decide a thing without pretending it's not, pretending you first. The steps were fieldstone set into a poured bed, careful work from when hands were steadier because nothing had asked them to type yet. He could see where the mortar had let go, hairline by hairline, and where a leaf had chosen to become fossil rather than compost. He stepped out. The rock took his weight with a small, agreeable groan. He climbed, counting aloud the way you do when a rhythm wants to prove it's a law. 7, 8, 9. A wet line at his ankles where he had waded the shallow to push the skiff in. 10, 11, 12. He stopped where stone ended. The sidewalls rose one more course and then gave way to air. Ahead of him, nothing. Above him, more nothing. And yet his right foot, when he slid it forward with the caution of a man who had once fallen through a rotten porch and did not intend to audition for that pain again, found resistance. Not stone, not water. Not empty. A density like stretched cloth, like cold-pressed sugar, like a stare that remembered itself and refused to forget just because the lake had been told to be a lake. He drew his foot back, scalp prickling, breath in a pocket he didn't want to open too fast. He looked around to see if anyone else had been presented this joke. No one. In late September, a Tuesday can make a cove your private chapel. Far out, a pontoon boat moved like a floor with music on it. Closer in, a blue heron had made the stump of an old post into a claim. Riven set his palm above the end of the stone into the air where a banister would be if someone had finished the thought. He felt nothing until he pushed a hair past what he thought was safe. Then he felt a boundary, the exact height of a handrail in a code book he could recite. He smiled despite the way his heart had decided to pick up the tempo. Something here hadn't drowned entirely. Something here had decided to keep going up. He does not scare fast, Riven. He is a man who has gotten into dark water at night, kindly, and come back calmer for it. But he respects a place with a memory. He went back down the 12 risers and climbed into the skiff and sat with his hand on the tiller and let the lake tell him if it wanted him to be braver than his grandmother would approve. The wind was a rumor now. On the far shore, a transformer hummed with the stale sweetness of electricity. He turned the motor off and drifted with his fingers brushing the gunwale and felt for the old current under the new. A loon called once out in the main channel, the syllable bending toward a kind of loneliness that doesn't need an audience. Riven looked back at the steps. The air above the 13th riser shimmered, a trick of light or a rule he hadn't been told yet. He swore softly in the old way that buys you permission to try again. He pulled the skiff onto the red bank, tied it off to a scar of root, and went back up the 12. He did what his hands knew to do. He turned a coin on its edge and rolled it along the last stone. When it tipped forward into air, it did not fall. It sat against nothing, as if pressed to a glass he could not see. He slid it forward with one finger and felt it drag over an edge. He slid his boot after it and met a tread that had weight. He put his full foot down and his bones agreed that physics had not been insulted, only invited to a different kind of party. He brought the other foot up. He stood on the 13th step of something that existed without confessing to the eye. He took one more. 14. He stopped. He is not a fool. He turned to look at the lake, which does not care if you find it holy or treacherous, so long as you understand which mood it is in. The cove held its breath. He stepped backward down the 2 air treads with a caution that felt like a prayer you say without agreeing you're saying it. He stood again on stone that had no arguments and breathed the kind of breath that renters of boats make when the motor coughs once and then forgives you. Lake Lanier carries stories the way clay carries footprints. Old towns lie under it, old churches, the ghost lanes of Old Federal Road. People will tell you about a stalled truck on a fogged bridge and a handprint on the back window after, about divers who won't go down a second time because they looked through a school of crappie and saw a porch swing move. Some of that is what happens when humans leave water to be the keeper of their history. Some of that is people being lonely and needing their fear to wear a costume. Riven carried none of those stories in the silly way. He carried them the practical way. He knew people had been told their land would drown for the good of cities they would never see, and some of those people had said their names into the bank and put rocks one on another to make the land remember. He went home with the staircase in his notebook and in his knees. He did not say the shape of it to the bartender at the place on Brown's Bridge, who called everybody chief. He did not post a photo because the lake punishes people who turn it into spectacle. He slept badly and woke before his alarm and made coffee meaner than necessary and drove back with a coil of thin rope and a chalk box and the tape measure he used when perfection had to be part of the bill. Morning Lake, blue as breath. The skiff skittered over wind ruffles and slid into the cove willing. He tied a chalk line at the last stone and played it out up the air, marking nothing with blue dust that caught in nothing and hung there like a trick. He laughed once, quietly. He measured riser height with the tape and found consistency that would have made a county inspector nod. He tied a loop in the rope and lowered it down the near face of the steps. The loop sat against an invisible edge and held, not tight, not loose, as if politely told to wait. Half an hour went by that way. Numbers, angles. The carpenter in him building a drawing that would keep his fear inside its lines. When he finished, he sat with his back against the sidewall and let his head find the cool of stone that had learned shade. The world stepped closer. From somewhere he could not triangulate came a sound that reminded him of a bicycle bell rung just once. In politeness, he stood. The sound did not come again. He walked down the 12 and waited on the shoreline while the lake decided whether to ignore him or to grant him more. A woman called from the top of the red bank. Riven looked up. She was tall and rangy, mid-40s, wearing the kind of straw hat that makes a person look like they know how to move in weather. She carried a camera with a strap that had been repaired twice and a notebook bulging with the kind of paper that did not come out of printers. She introduced herself with a grin that answered questions he had not asked. Mara Clary. She ran a small outfit that mapped drowned towns and grave relocations for counties that cared to admit their forgetting. She had a copy of the Army Corps' old charts and a habit of showing up where the lake loaned the present to the past. "I've been told you've got steps," she said, "and that they keep going up." He wanted to ask who had been talking. He wanted not to have his name in a stranger's mouth. But she put her hand on the sidewall like a careful person says hello to an old horse, and the way her face took in what she saw made him feel less alone in his own seeing. He nodded. He told her his name and the number of air treads he'd let himself trust. She whistled low. "Lanier tells on itself every few years," she said, eyes on the shimmer above the 13th. "But I haven't seen it do this. Fieldstone, that would have been a front walk probably. Or the stairs to a porch. You can tell from the way these aren't as steep as church steps. And there would have been a dog who slept halfway up until someone came home at supper." "Everyone says that about any porch," he said, smiling despite himself. "Only because it keeps being true," she said, and laughed like a sound the cove had missed. They measured together, she took photos, he held a stick out over the air risers and watched the end bounce against nothing. They left offerings the old way. He peeled the paper off a peppermint and set it on the third stone step. She untied a strip of blue cloth from her hat and tied it to the root that held his skiff's rope. The lake, if it acknowledged that at all, did not show it. She opened her notebook to a page where she had copied in neat letters the names and dates of households taken when the valley was flooded in the early 1960s. 2 farms had sat on this spur, the Sumter place, the Jory place. Sumter had 5 children and a clean way with fence lines. Jory was famous for a Sunday table and a sour temperament the rest of the week. The county had cut checks and called it a necessity. The stairs could have been either family's. But on the sidewall, low near the 5th riser, they found a mark cut into mortar with a nail or a stubborn penknife. A letter. "J. You think Jory," she said. "Or June," he said. "Or Josephine. Or a boy who didn't get to grow into his handwriting rights, their first initial into any stone that isn't busy." The lake made a small sound against the hull, a shrug. They came back the next day, and the next after that. In the afternoons, teenagers on rental jet skis came doing grammar the water did not admire. In the mornings, a heron watched like a magistrate. Once, a man in a bass boat cut his engine and drifted nearer and asked if the invisible was real or a trick. And when Riven told him the truth, he raised his cap and said, "Well then," and idled away because some facts want to be left alone to keep being facts. On the 5th day, just after noon, when the light loses some of its slant, and the lake starts its long exhale toward evening, the air changed. Riven was on the 14th invisible tread, Mara two below on stone, the rope tied at his ankle as if that kind of thing would help. He felt a pressure move across his shin like a child's study of a newel post. The hair on his forearms declared a vote. He looked up. Above him, a faint dark line hung in the bright. A lintel, if you wanted to pretend to see one. A line where a door might have decided to sit if it still meant to. He lifted his hand slowly and let it hover. It met resistance at the height where a latch would be if people had followed the same measurements here as they did in town. He pressed a fraction and felt the air give. Not much, not enough to invite him, only enough to say, "I know what you were asking for," and no. He withdrew his hand. He did not try again. He went back down and sat on the 6th stone step and put his elbows on his knees and let his head go heavy in the way of a man who knows the difference between a closed door and an answer. "Not today," Mara said, not unkindly. "Doesn't mean never." A storm ran around the rim of the lake that night and forgot how to come down. The next morning broke clean and noisy, with birds relieved to be right about the Sunday. When they returned to the steps, the peppermint was gone. The strip of cloth whispered against the root when the wind remembered it. On the 4th stone riser, a line had been drawn in the red dust by a finger that had not belonged to wind. 4 short lines, 1 long. The way a person keeps track of days when they are doing a job no one else is counting, they looked at each other like people who have been included in a conversation without earning it. Mara wrote down the marks in that tidy, practical hand. Riven climbed to 14 again and did not press the air where the latch would be. He listened instead. It is an old trick. The more you don't demand to hear, the more willing a place is to say its piece. Somewhere above him, at the end of the invisible run, a sound came faint, almost an opinion. The scrape of a chair, foot against a wooden floor. Once, then a breath, remarkably ordinary, let out by someone who was done with a small effort and is pleased to have finished. He let his knees bend and went back down step by careful step. The county put out a notice, polite as a church lady, asking people not to climb anything that felt like absence. A man from the Corps came by with a clipboard and a caution that did not include humor and told them to rope the place from the bank. They tied a line and left it slack enough to be ignored by whatever needed to come and go. Mara logged coordinates and photographs and the exact color of the lichens on the sidewall. Riven made a drawing of the steps that showed the air ones the way you show trust, with dotted lines and a note that says, "As found." Word spread anyway. It always does when to leave a thing alone would be the more complicated form of love. A grandmother came and watched from the shade and told her granddaughter a story about the summer her brother rode a bike into a field that is now part of the lake and fell and did not cry, because corn leaves will cut you if you give them. An audience. A man in a Braves cap stood for a long time with his hands in the back pockets of his jeans and didn't tell anyone why his eyes kept the gloss they kept. A boy clapped once and apologized, and then asked if the staircase sounded like anything, and when Riven told him about the scrape and the breath, the boy looked toward the place where a door might be and whispered, "Thank you," like a student to a teacher who has handed out permission slips to freedom. On a Wednesday morning in early October, the lake rose 2 inches. The first stone step went green again. The 12th stayed dry. Riven set his palm to the sidewall as he had begun to do without design and said the names of the months out loud as if they were a key. Mara arrived late, hair in a bandana printed with little cranes, a thermos in one hand and a sheet of onion skin paper in the other, the thin kind that takes pencil and lets the stone's texture come up through. She rubbed the J, the nail-cut letter, and the tally marks. When she lifted the paper, the letter and the lines looked like a message written by someone whose words had to be rationed. She tucked the rubbing into her notebook with a care Riven recognized as kin to prayer. By noon, clouds built into a boast. Mara packed her camera because electric things deserve not to be insulted by weather. Riven untied the rope at his ankle and coiled it with the absent-minded competence of someone who likes ropes for the way they make order out of risk. The air above the 14th step felt different. Cooler, somehow. Denser. He looked up and wanted more than he would have admitted the week before to see something acknowledge him. Not a face, not a figure, an idea. The lake refused. It kept to its rights. Before the storm broke, a small group arrived in silence. Not tourists, not thrill seekers, people in good shoes that did not belong to docks. A woman in a navy blazer, a man whose tie had been loosened by degrees and had stopped at 3, an older woman with a cane that looked like it had been carved by someone who understood trees better than money. They stood on the bank above the line and watched the steps like people watching someone figure skate after having once skated the same routine 3 decades ago and remembering what the body used to hold. The older woman spoke first, to the stone, not to the living. "You kept it," she said. "You stubborn thing. I told them you would." She introduced herself when Riven climbed down to the bank with his curiosity plainly showing. Ada Sumter Jory. Not a marriage, she was quick to clarify, but a habit of names borrowed and kept. Her father had been a Sumter, her mother a Jory by necessity and grievance. She had been 10 when the men from the government came and put stakes on the hill and told her they were measuring to make the river useful. She had been 14 when the kitchen was dismantled and stored in a relative's shed, and the porch chairs were put on a truck without the porch. She had been 15 when the lake finally climbed to the 7th stair, and the dogs refused to sleep where they had always slept, and had to learn ground new as a dollar. "My granddaddy set those stones," she said, chin lifting toward the steps. He knew the grade by eye. House stood there. She pointed at the air, ran long that way. Kitchen at the back, where mornings were honest. Stairs to the sleeping rooms tucked in right of the door. He told me we build stairs for coming and going and for waiting. That last part is where the world gets the math wrong. She cleared her throat once, a small thing that meant a larger thing had moved through it. "My brother wrote his letter J in the mortar before it set," she said, and smiled fully for the first time. He was 5 and mad because he had not been allowed to carry a stone and needed to have done something the porch would remember. They watched the lake together as it considered which forenoon belonged to which afternoon. Mara showed Ada the rubbing, and Ada put her palm on the paper like a hand over a baby's sleeping flank. "He stayed mean," she said of Jory, but without any real heat. But he loved that stare. Sat halfway up when he had nothing to do and the weather had nothing to argue about. Played that little bell you keep hearing because he liked the neatness of a sound that stops when you take your finger off it. The storm arrived, they covered what needed covering, the skiff rocked and complained, and then remembered it had been in worse moods and calmed. The rain washed the red dust off the risers and gave them back their gray. The air cooled like a head turning on a pillow to the comfortable side. Ada walked down to the 2nd step and touched it like the forehead of a child with a fever breaking. "Enough," she said to the rain, to the year, to the air that had learned to hold treads. In the weeks that followed, the staircase did what durable things do when they decide to belong to more than one story. It kept being itself. The lake rose and smudged the lower steps and then pulled back like a long breath returned. Riven kept coming because he had begun to like the feeling of leaving a place better than he found it by doing nothing but listening the way a well-made chair listens when a tired person sits. Mara wrote a piece for the County Historical Society that began with the sentence, "There are places we drown and places that refuse." Ada came twice more and told the stair her brother's best and worst. And once, on a bright Sunday, when the buzz of outboards sounded like cicadas pretending to be important, she brought a tin of biscuits and left one on the 3rd step because her mother would have called it manners. On a morning in November, the air thin and brisk, frost like pale sugar on shaded clay, Riven came alone. The lake had taken back an inch, the first 2 steps glowed green. He stood at the foot and waited the way you learn to wait when you've been given more than you asked and are smart enough not to get greedy. The wind came off the water and put its fingers through his hair with a familiarity he hadn't earned. Above the 14th tread, the line where a lintel would be shivered and then settled. He put his hand out at the height of a latch and did not press. "Thank you," he said to nothing and to something. He went home and made lunch and fixed a neighbor's sagging cabinet and walked his dog in the long honey of 4 o'clock. He slept that night without the lake climbing the stairs of his thoughts. He dreamed he was sanding a handrail he could not see and woke with the particular ache in his forearm that tells a man he did a good day's work in the world that matters and the one that does not need him but lets him in anyway. If you go out to Lake Lanier on a fall day after a long dry, when the wind has the courtesy to lie down and let the surface polish itself, you can find the cove if you know who to ask and you promise out loud not to bring a ladder. The staircase will be there, stepping up from water into air with the patience of a body that has learned not to argue with time. You can put your boot on the 12th stone and your breath on your rib cage and decide if you will push your foot forward into the space where the 13th waits. If you do, it will hold. Not because wonder owes you, but because someone set a measure here with care, and because sometimes the world keeps an old promise in a new element. Say the year out loud when you find it. 2022. Say the place by its names. Lanier and the valley it drowned. Say the people if you know them. Sumter. Jory. Say the letter on the wall. J. Say the noise a bicycle bell makes when a brother likes attention and the porch has all afternoon. If you leave something, make it small. A ribbon, a peppermint, a finger laid gently in dust to make a line that will blow away with the next weather. Walk back down, let your knees do what they were built to do. Put your hand on the sidewall the way you would on a friend's shoulder when leaving them on their own porch in the dark to listen to the crickets. The staircase will keep going up whether or not your eyes can follow it. It will keep its measure in the air. The lake will rise and cover the lower treads and then fall back and confess again. Boats will hum. Herons will judge. A woman in a straw hat will rub letters onto paper, and a man with a dog who sleeps through sirens will coil rope and listen. And somewhere under the calm skin of the cove, where red clay holds onto everything it can hold, a front door you cannot see will stay shut and not unkindly, practicing the hardest kind of hospitality there is, offering you a way to ascend and a way to wait, and trusting you to know which one belongs to you today. Her phone pinged at a grave with her name. The notification bloomed on her screen the moment her shoes left the gravel and slid onto the soft path between moss-dark stones. A small bell chime, bright as glass. A banner at the top. You have arrived, Edeni Hale. The words sat there as calmly as a weather app, as if the city had decided to label her the way it labels a bridge or a square. The place was Bonaventure Cemetery in Savannah, Georgia. Spanish moss hung in long, steady sentences from the live oaks. The river kept its secrets behind the bluff and breathed like a sleeping room. It was late afternoon on a Sunday in early November, the air cool enough to make her wish for sleeves and warm enough to forgive her for forgetting them. Before we begin, tell me, where are you listening from and what time is it there? Her name was Edeni Hale, 28. She worked in visitor services at a small maritime museum upriver, the kind of job that made her memorize the angles of ships and the dates when storms came ashore. She liked fonts and quiet, and the sound salt makes drying on stone. She was visiting Bonaventure because her friend Anson had flown in from Minneapolis for a long weekend, and the two of them liked places that let you feel your breath in your mouth. The year was 2021. Phones knew where you were within decent intimacy. Some headstones wore small plaques with codes that asked to be scanned and promised a story. They had parked on Bonaventure Road under an oak that had learned to be older than most houses. The sky was simple, a clean coin of light. The volunteer at the office had given them a paper map and a soft-voiced list of locations worth the walk if you wanted your day to hold. Look for the little angels facing east. Find the section where the camellias keep blooming against instruction. There's a family plot that feels like a room you shouldn't step into without knocking. No one mentioned a notification. Edeni stared at her phone. The banner did not give a location like Section F or Plot 31. It was the same tag her calendar used when she arrived at work or home. You have arrived, Edeni Hale. As if she were a place. As if the grave were her. Anson leaned toward the screen and squinted. He was tall and light-footed, a teacher of high school literature who carried poems in his pockets like receipts. He read the banner and then her face and made a small arranging motion with his hands, the way he does when he wants to place humor where fright is trying to sit. That's a bug, he said, not unkindly. Or a geofence you made and forgot. Did you tell your phone to remind you to be yourself today? She clicked the banner to see where the phone thought she belonged. A map opened, a blue dot pulsed with the steady patience of a small heartbeat. A gray pin sat 100 feet east in a section labeled McAllister. The pop-up bubble above the pin read Idany Hale in the same unsentimental font. She did not have a virtual contact called a cemetery. She had not created a reminder to arrive at her own name. The phone had decided the path curled between stones with dates that made you speak them out loud, because numbers are easier to hold when they come through the mouth. 1873, 1920, 2009. The Oaks leaned as if sold on the idea that the living need rehearsal space. Anson spoke a tour fact about a poet who loved this place and whose plaque visitors touch in a small, quick superstition. Idoni nodded because liking facts is a way of staying steady. Her pocket shook again. Another chime, the same banner. You have arrived. Idany Hale. She breathed the way the yoga teacher on the internet tells you to. In through a count of 4, hold for 4, out for 6. They followed the path east until the bluff opened its shoulder and let the wind test their sleeves. The section ahead was a little higher, a little more sure of itself. A plot enclosed by low stone, dressed in ivy, sat beneath a live oak that looked like a table that had decided to grow legs. In the center stood a headstone gray as rain, taller than Idoni's shoulder. The name at the top held Idany Hale. She stopped. You might have stopped too. Her name was not common. Her mother had found it in a book of Old English names and liked the way it sounded like a promise made under a tree. She had never met another Idany. To see the letters in this order on stone felt like stepping into a movie where you have lines you did not audition for. Anson's hand found her elbow without a show of it. He had the sense not to say, wow, or are you kidding? He stood with her and let the river finish a sentence neither of them had started. The dates carved below the name were the first clean relief, 1974 to 2014, not hers. A woman 2 decades older, gone 7 years now. Under the dates, a line that read as Keeper of the Keys. The stone carried a small oval of glazed photo, a face with hair tucked back, eyes steady, a glint of a key ring at the edge of the frame. The oval was rubbed to a shine from fingers, the way love polishes small things while refusing to say it is love. On the right-hand corner of the stone, someone had bolted one of the new plaques with its little square of patterns. Scan to learn more. People who love story cannot resist a square that holds one. Idany lifted her phone and let the camera see. A link opened without asking for anything. A page built by a memorial service company bloomed. At the top, the name again. Below, a small biography. A life lived with habits, upright and kind. A childhood in Chatham County, a long run as cemetery sexton. The last line read in a voice that felt like a woman sitting on a step with a mug and a warning and a grin. If you need something, tell the ground. It will tell me. While she read, the phone hummed again. Not a banner this time. A little circle pulsing at the top of the screen, the way maps announce a place with enthusiasm. The circle flashed once, then settled. Idany swiped down to see the source, a calendar reminder with no category. White, titled simply, Arrived. Location, here. She had not written that. The phone, perhaps, had decided the day needed a label, or the small plaque had more to it than the page admitted. Anson said the woman in the photo had librarian eyes. He meant that as a compliment. He pointed at the key ring. He said his grandmother had been a keeper of the keys at a church in North Dakota, and those women know where every grief sits at every hour, the way a night janitor knows which chairs spit gum and which ones sigh. They stood a while. People walked past in respectful silence, guided by a docent's voice that held just enough theater to keep 15 people from wandering into their own daydreams. Spanish moss moved like thought repeating itself. A flake of light rose off the river and fell back as if it had changed its mind about being air. It would have been a good story already finding your own name on stone, a phone that had the audacity to tell you you had arrived, but something else decided to be true. A little tone sounded from the phone, the way sounds do when an app you forgot you had decides to help. It was the noise her airdrop made when someone nearby wanted to share a photo at inopportune moments. The screen shifted to a dialogue. A file offered to send itself to her. The sender name was a string of letters and numbers that meant nothing. The file name read Keys. Anson leaned in and made his face calm. Decline, he said gently, because strangers in public places with quick hands make tricks, and both of them work in museums and have seen every version of the human habit of testing boundaries. She hovered. Decline would be wise. Accept would be a dare. She pressed accept because sometimes you let stories finish what they start. The file downloaded. It was not a photo, it was an audio file, a minute 42 in length. The waveform showed it wasn't silence. She tilted the phone toward her own ear instead of speaker because you don't open a voice in a cemetery loud unless the voice has earned the right. Static first, then the sound of wind combing something thin, then a woman's voice, the age of a woman, who tells tools where they belong and expects cooperation. The voice said, dry as a towel and warm as a summer kitchen. If you are standing over me, child, and your name is mine, you can help me keep my promises. Put your phone on the stone and leave it be a minute. It will tell you where to stand next. Anson's eyebrows did a small jazz riff and then tried to behave. Okay, he said softly, a word that meant, I am here and I am not going to ruin this with cleverness. Idony set the phone on the flat top of the headstone the way the voice had instructed. The screen slid into its lock. Her reflection replaced her. The oval photo looked past her shoulder the way old photos always do. She counted in her head as a way to keep the childish fear of being tricked from standing up and knocking the ritual with its elbow. 50, 60, 78. The phone buzzed once, she lifted it. The map opened of its own accord. The blue dot had moved nothing. The gray pin had changed. It labeled another grave 30 yards north with a name neither of them had seen on the paper map. Rosin Hale. A second name. Another Hale. The first name was Welsh and not common here. They went because the day had asked enough times to be answered polite. The second stone stood lower, more modest. The granite, a color you could never find on purpose if you looked in a catalog. The dates were older, 1931 to 1999. The epitaph read, She kept the gate lighted, and under that, in smaller letters, so faint you could only see them when the cloud put its hand over the sun, a line, Rosine was born. Rosine Idris. She married into Hale and stayed. Tell my niece if she comes through here that I see her when I count keys. I am not anybody's niece, Idony said aloud, and then took a breath because she heard the defensiveness squirreled underneath. I mean, not hers. You might be more people's niece than you know, Anson said gently, a man who had grown up with uncles who weren't uncles and yet were more family than the kind that wears your face. They stood while the wind added a signature to the bottom of the page of the day. The river put its shoulder against the bank and leaned. The phone did not ping again for a while. A cardinal went from one branch to another with the purposeful speed of a person who knows where the parts are stored. A group of teenagers trailed an auntie through the lanes, popping gum in a respectful way, which is a regional miracle. Idony looked up Rosin on the cemetery's database because when your heart gets odd, facts make a braid to hold on to. The database was one of those volunteer-built websites that carry the tone of a potluck where everyone brings a dish so exact it shames you for choosing salad. Rosin's entry was thorough. Born Rhonda Valley, came across with parents as a child, settled in Chatham County, married one Mr. Hale, worked checklist after checklist for the electrical union office, sang alto in church with the patience of an anvil, survived by no children, preceded by older brothers, all gone. Niece mentioned in an obituary in 1999 with no name given. Anson made a sound that meant the story had wiped its hands on his shirt and was ready to cook. The phone chimed once more, now with the tone her museum app uses when a beacon in an exhibit hands you a fact. She had turned beacons off last month because being interrupted by history while in history felt a bit like a stage whisper in a quiet theater. She had not turned beacons back on. The screen read, "A note is waiting." A map pinpointed the little brick building the cemetery uses as a workshop for the grounds crew. A path drew itself in blue between the Hales and the shop, like a string in a child's game. They went because keys that ask to be found deserve not to rust. The door to the shop was propped with a cinder block, the way doors are propped everywhere when the weather learns to be useful. A radio played a station that chose old soul and occasional baseball score updates. No one was at the counter. A bell stood there anyway, the kind that rings a sound like a glass penny. Anson rang it because he likes participating in obvious rituals. A man in his 50s with a badge that read August came in from the back, wiping his hands on a rag that had earned its keep. "You folks need a map?" he asked, then took a longer look at their faces and revised. "Or a minute." "We were by the hailstones," Idony said, and watched the way a man looks when a rhyme finds his ear and tells him it cares. August nodded. "Course you were," he said. "I keep an envelope for that family. Been waiting on who it's waiting on." He reached under the counter, where drawers have learned to hold what should not be lost, and brought up a large yellow envelope with a blue paperclip that had rusted a little by choosing weather. The envelope had 3 words on the front in tidy block letters. For the next Idony, heat went across her face like an honest light. August saw it and stilled. He handed her the envelope the way people hand one another babies, meaning well and moving slow. She opened it with her thumb. Inside, 3 items. A small brass key, old, not ornate, with teeth filed like a decision. A folded sheet torn from a spiral notebook, edges soft with years. And a wallet-sized photo of a woman in a blue work shirt with a name patch and a grin you could feel on your back like afternoon Sunday. The patch read, "Idony." The face belonged to the woman on the first stone. The note was written in blue ballpoint in a hand that pressed harder than paper deserves. It read, simple. "For the next Idony in this county who can hear me the way a key hears a lock, my niece is out there. She won't say yes to the word niece because words are stubborn. She'll need to open the box in the old mausoleum we keep for tools and favors. The key is for the small door on the left. Lift on the latch while you turn. The box has what belongs to her and me and her grandmother. If she is standing at my stone with a phone, she will know that I know. Don't bring a crowd. Bring one friend who reads instructions with his eyes. Leave the key when you are done. We can count without hands here. I'm not someone's niece," she said again, and heard how the sentence grew less certain with practice. Her mother's family tree began and ended in a different state. A line of women who told polite lies to spare one another the sharp edges and did their grief in broom closets. Her father had not survived long enough to name distant relations. He had left behind a bent screwdriver and a smell that her body still could find when a day asked. Anson's hand found the counter in a quick pat, like checking for keys as you leave the house. "You don't have to be a niece to be the person meant to do a thing," he said. "But also you might, and it might not matter how that happened." August tapped the counter twice, a habit that sounded like a yes. "The small left door," he said. "People never see it. Take the path behind the office and go right at the angel with the missing hand. The mausoleum is the little brick one that looks polite. The left door sticks the way a lie sticks to a room. Do what the note said, lift and turn." They went back into the light. The blue string on the map did not bother now to draw. The path knew their feet. The angel with the missing hand stood where the volunteer had said, "Angels stand, face east," blank expression that suggested she had witnessed every century and found nothing quite bad enough to frown at yet. The brick mausoleum waited with that small pride buildings have when they know they are not the grandest on the block, but are the one that does the job without complaint. The left door looked like a panel added later. The brass latch had the smoothness that comes of being touched by people who mean to get work done. Idony slid the key in, the teeth caught, and then thought better of it. She lifted the latch with her other hand and turned. The lock gave. The door opened 6 inches and stopped. ticked by a wooden wedge that had been insinuated at the bottom by someone who had not wanted the door opened by accident or habit. Anson reached down and pulled the wedge free. It had a date burned into it with a soldering iron. 2014. The year on the first stone. Inside was a closet of sorts, pegboards and hooks, a rake missing its second tooth, a coil of twine that had memorized its circle and would not learn a new trick, and on a shelf at eye level, a tin bread box with a domed lid, painted a green faded to the color of river glass. No lock. Written in the same blue hand on a piece of tape was a word: Hail. She lifted the lid like a person lifts lids on boxes that might contain bees or inheritance. Inside, arranged with the blunt care of someone who never made a mess unless a branch fell where it shouldn't, sat 3 items: a narrow ledger with a black cloth spine, a key fob with 3 small brass tags stamped with numbers, and a folded paper bag, the kind grocery stores use for baking flour, rolled tight and rubber banded with an elasticity that made its own sound. She opened the ledger first because pages are her map. Names, rows of them, dates, locations in the cemetery with check marks where gates had failed and been repaired. Next to some entries, a small star. Those starred names also appeared on the little brass tags. Numbers, not random, not plot numbers, locker numbers. The cemetery kept a bank of lockers for the grounds crew in a shed she had not thought needed one. Her phone chimed in her pocket, a small suggestion from the maps. Direction nudged, left, then right. Then, would you like to add this location to favorites? She ignored the phone. The ledger asked for attention. On the inside back cover of the ledger, a note in different handwriting. Spare for Rosen's niece if she finds it. Locker 12 holds what isn't in the ground. If days are bad, tell the river. The river tells me. The tags on the key fob read 10, 12, 14. She ran her finger over 12 the way a person does over a scar. She felt nothing supernatural. She felt focus. Anson took the bag at her nod and unwound the rubber band. Inside lay 2 objects wrapped in butcher paper. He unrolled the first. A locket. Gold. Thin as luck. With a hairline crack. Shaped like lightning. If lightning were careful. Inside, a photograph so tiny it could be breathed away if you weren't paying mind. A baby in a christening gown that had borrowed lace from a curtain. The face pinched in the way newborn faces pinch. On the back, in pencil that had migrated into the paper like a crop planting itself, a name. Rosen Idris Hale. A line below it, for my niece to hold if she comes to hear me. He unrolled the second. A county map from 1968, creased, the paper's fiber gone feathery at the folds. A road circled in blue pencil, a margin note. That old step bridge out by the waterworks. We left something in the middle beam in 74. If you can't find it, it means we didn't need it. If you can, well, you'll know. We are not going to a step bridge at dusk, Anson said, a man who loved old maps and also loved not getting in the paper under the wrong kind of headline. We are going to find Locker 12 while the Museum of the Dead is still on our side. They found the shed. August had seen their faces through the glass and met them halfway with the keys because some stories ask for a witness who knows better than to narrate. He led them to a wall of small metal lockers, each door painted the dull red of a barn that had not given up but had learned to pace itself. He unlocked 12 and stepped back. Inside lay a small stack of shallow boxes, each labeled with a date. The top was the 1, 2014. Under that, 2008. Under that, 1999. Anson lifted the top box and set it on a workbench. He opened it with care. Inside, wrapped in tissue that had become more suggestion than paper, sat a handful of objects that people keep for reasons the living should not pretend to understand quickly. A church key. A photo of 3 women, arms crossed, outside a union hall, one of them with a name patch that read R. Hale, a Polaroid of a red step bridge with water under it purling toward a bend. A handwritten note folded small. The note read, "For the niece who knows the word niece because keys hum when they find their door. You were not an accident. We kept count. We named you all the ways we could. Our names were soft and stubborn. Take what you want, Leave the ledger so the ground does not have to work alone. She sat because standing felt rude. She is a woman whose mother did not tell stories with this kind of curve. She gathered the truth like thread. Her mother had been born in this county and left when she was 19, a bus to another state, a man met in a grocery line, a child years later when the idea of staying had become heavy. She did not talk about siblings, claimed not to remember cousins, flinched when the phrase back home came up. The name Hale had come not from romance, but from accident or choice, a name taken because other names insisted on being something else. Rosen Idris had married into Hale, but the family had been built long before that. Keys had been passed with and without rings. August stood with a posture that says, I will not take your moment away from you. When the radio in the shed shifted to a weather update, he reached and turned it down so the forecast would not interrupt a storm already occurring. Anson put his hand flat on the bench and counted to 8 for no reason his body would confess. Tell me if you want me not to read the other notes, he said. The kind of friend a person needs in rooms where both mystery and bureaucracy show up at the same table. Read, she said. We're already here. The note in the 1999 box was from Rosen and felt like laughter on a porch when the pots are already washed. The house we put ourselves in is not one the county believes holds blood, she wrote. But it holds me. And it holds the keys. If you need a name, the river has one. If you need a door, the shed does. In the box from 2008, a different hand, shakier, it read, I kept the lights in the gate, all through the storms. I think sometimes we are simply the people who keep lights. If you are mine, you will know when to turn one on. In the box from 2014 was a letter from the sexton whose face smiled off the oval on the stone. She wrote like a woman who had lived by the kind of lists that get family through winter. I have no children of my own except the Gates, she wrote, but I have a niece whether the paper says it or not. I kept her not by being in the room, but by owning my stubbornness. If she stands over me with a phone and hears me, she will take what she needs and leave what she should, and I will go on counting with my hands in dirt like I like to do. They left the boxes as they'd found them, shifted nothing but air. August closed the locker with a satisfaction that felt like lining up the edges on a stack of bills and smoothing them down. He did not ask for anyone's story. He had one of his own, built of this place, and the line of names he keeps with the quiet grace of a man who waters plants. By the time they stepped back into the paths, the light had hunched into evening. The river sounded less like sheet music and more like a phrase repeating. The map on her phone had stopped suggesting anything and gone back to pretending it was an obedient device. The air smelled like river, camellia, and a penny someone had worried in a good pocket for a decade. Anson asked if she wanted to go to the step bridge. She said no, in a voice that held both sorrow and a plan. Tomorrow, in daylight. When names sit on surfaces more politely. He agreed because this is what friendship is, a committee about timing. That night, she sat at her kitchen table with the ledger borrowed under August's nod and the locket under her thumb. She called her mother. The call rolled twice, and then the voice she knew and loved and sometimes resented filled the line with wind and caution. They made small talk for 30 seconds, and then they moved somewhere they had not walked together. Ma, she said, who was Rosen? Who was Idony before me? Silence, sincere. A kettle somewhere in the house. The refrigerator willing itself to be steady. Finally, her mother sighed, and the sigh sounded like a drawer allowed to close after being held open too many years. My aunt, she said, not by blood, by the kind of line people draw when the law does not help. She and the other one, the sexton, kept me safe when I was little and didn't know that my father wasn't safe to be around. They ran the lights in the cemetery and in the loose latch doors and told me when to lock things and when to open them. They were more my aunts than any of the few relatives that share me. When I left everything. I thought that was how you survive. I have not told you the parts you asked me about because I thought you'd want something tidier than I had, and because I am silly enough to think if I did not say the names, the ache would go to sleep. She told a story of a girl who sat on a stoop counting keys while two women kept a town's small doors in working order, literal and figurative. She told how those women had taught her to move through rooms with respect and to leave envelopes where they'd be needed. She did not speak tenderly about the man who invented the silence she had carried. She spoke tenderly about the other men, the ones who changed locks without asking why, and taught a child where the ladders were kept for days when rain insisted. I should have told you, her mother said finally, soft with the fatigue of a woman who has not confessed a simple truth for a long time. You have two names, the one I gave you and the one the other women left for you to find when you were ready. You belong to both. You belong to yourself most. They went to the step bridge the next day. It was out by the old waterworks, just as the margin note had said. The county had let Weeds try to become the principal of the place, and the Weeds had accepted the assignment with poor posture and pride. The bridge stood, red paint scabbed into beauty, water under it moving with the impatient streams have when the river bullies them with schedule. In the middle beam, behind a square of metal the size of a book, a hollowed space. Inside, wrapped in waxed paper, a ring of keys on a chain that had learned 3 hands. Each key had a number, 10, 12, 14. The fob matched the tags in the box. Beside the keys lay a square of paper with a tiny handprint in paint the color of that old camellia behind the office. A child had been here once. She had pressed her hand down. Someone had saved it for a woman who would put her hand down later and understand they did not take the keys. She set her palm over the handprint. The sizes did not match. The feeling did. She closed the plate. She and Anson walked back to the car with the sun finding their shoulders and the hum of insects writing their own accurate dissertations on persistence. Back at the cemetery, she returned the ledger. August nodded like a man at the end of a good piece of work. She walked to the first stone and put 2 fingers on the glazed oval where the sexton's face had learned to look past tourists to the river. She did not speak. She let the ground and the river carry whatever needed moving. Her phone did not ping again there. It would ping months later, once in a grocery store aisle in a different city, when an older woman in a Union jacket looked at her and tilted her head in a way that meant keys are a language. It would ping once again when she held the hand of a friend through a night much too long and heard as clearly as weather a voice say, lift and turn. It would ping at odd hours for the next several years when doors asked to be locked or opened with care. Sometimes it would be an app acting like a person. Sometimes it would be a person acting like a map. Sometimes it would be a name arriving in a room with good manners and old roots. If you want the tidy ending, it is this. She wrote to the memorial company to ask who had access to the airdrop at the stone. No one answered in a way that satisfied anyone who cares about permissions. She kept the photo of the sexton in her wallet behind the museum badge and found that having a face like that near your ID keeps you from forgetting where the door to the stairwell is in a fire. She learned to count gates with her hands, the way women in that county had since the first lock learned the first habit. She took pies to August's workbench and listened to his stories. She phoned her mother on Sundays and let the conversation go long enough to find the sentence that mattered each week. She carried with her the sentence from the oval's page. If you need something, tell the ground. It will tell me. If you want the less tidy truth, it is this. Sometimes your life is a geofence you didn't set. Sometimes you arrive at your own name carved in stone, and the stone says, welcome. Sometimes you are the niece of women who bent keys into new jobs and called that bending prayer. Sometimes your phone pings at a grave, and the ping is only a device doing what it was taught, and sometimes it is a noise a river makes when it is trying to talk through everyone's machines at once. If this happens to you, if you walk under trees that have learned the art of holding up clouds, and a little bell sounds in your pocket, and your name appears as a place, don't panic. Stand where you are. Read the dates out loud so the year will stop pretending it is only a number. Touch the stone with 2 fingers, not more. Listen for the voice that sounds like someone who knows where the ladders are kept. If a key is offered, lift and turn. If a door sticks, lift and turn. If a person asks for a niece, say the word niece like a new tool you know how to use. And when you leave, take the long path that wanders near the bluff. The river will be there keeping count. The oaks will be there practicing their patient grammar. Your phone will settle back into behaving. The ground will remember you, not because you are special, but because that is what ground does for people who treat it like a partner. Somewhere behind you, a bell on a worker's desk will ring, and a man named August will nod to no one and say out loud into an empty shed, "She arrived." Then he will sweep the floor in slow, exact strokes, as if he were writing the names in dust and erasing them on purpose so the day could begin again and mean it.